Well, good evening, everyone. My name's John Highbush. I have the honor of being the executive director of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation. I just want to thank you all for coming out on this cold and chilly evening. In honor of our men and women who defend our freedom around the world, if you would please stand and join me for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Please be seated. Before we get started, there are a few people, well, more than a few, in the audience that I'd like to make sure we recognize. I'll go through it kind of quickly. First, I'd like to start with a good friend, Ambassador Bob Tuttle, President Bush's ambassador to the Court of St. James, Great Britain. Bob is also one of our trustees on the Reagan Foundation Board. Bob. Not to be outdone, but another member of our Foundation Board of Trustees, Mr. Ben Sutton. Ben, thank you for coming. You cannot miss him, former Congressman Elton Gallicly and his wife Janice. Elton, Janice. Assemblyman Scott Wilk and his wife Vanessa. I'm halfway done. Ventura County District Attorney Greg Totten. Greg, great to see you here. Our Ventura County Supervisor Peter Foy. Thousand Oaks Council Member Al Adam. Thousand Oaks City Attorney Tracy Noonan. And Moore Park Council Member Mark Van Dam and his wife Ute. You know, if you think about it, this evening, February 1st, is an important night in American history. That is, at least as far as the history of 2016 will be written. And why is it so important? Well, let's begin with the obvious. We are in the presence of one of our nation's finest public servants ever. He has served 8 United States presidents with distinction and has spent virtually his entire life protecting you, your family, and more broadly, the national security interests of the United States. When that hero, which is exactly what he is, comes to speak at the resting place of one of the greatest presidents of the past century, well, in my book, we are making some history here tonight. Secretary Gates, we are deeply honored that you've come on behalf of Mrs. Reagan and everyone here who supports the legacy of Ronald Reagan. Thank you for your sacrifice, your service, and your capable leadership for so many years. Now, we need only look about 1,500 miles to the east to see where history is also in the making tonight. As I speak, voters from Sioux City all the way to Cedar Rapids are casting secret ballots or dividing into groups at their local high schools, living rooms, or church basements at the Iowa caucuses. Tonight, Iowans will make history one way or the other. Will it be Trump, or Cruz, or Clinton, or Sanders, or Rubio, or you fill in the blank that emerges as a winner in the first in the nation contest tonight? In just a few hours, or even a few minutes, we will know. Now, as I said before, our guest this evening has served more U.S. presidents than just about every other person on this planet. So it should be concerning to all of us that he believes that there are very few candidates hoping to win Iowa tonight who have the sufficient leadership qualities to be the next president of the United States. In remarkably candid interviews and a forceful essay written by Secretary Gates just a few weeks ago, along with some pages found in his most recent book, A Passion for Leadership, there is some good news and some bad news. The good news is that one need not search too far in Dr. Gates' writing to see that in these difficult times, he believes our country is in need of a person with particular characteristics, a leader like Ronald Reagan, to be the next president of the United States. The bad news, as we all know, is that our admired 40th president lies at rest and in peace only about 100 yards from where you sit tonight. In my view, short of a resurrection, the next best thing that could happen to us is this. Whoever takes the Oval Office in early 2017 finds their way to the White House Library, locates this book, shuts themselves into the Oval Office door for a few hours, and does not come out to rule the greatest nation on the face of this earth until he or she has read it. It should be required reading for the next commander-in-chief. Ladies and gentlemen, if you would, please join me in welcoming to the Reagan Library the Honorable Robert Gates.
Thank you, John, for that kind and generous introduction, and thanks to all of you for coming out for this occasion. It's a pleasure for me to be back at the Reagan Library again. It's especially a pleasure since I was just in Washington a few days ago for the blizzard. As you know, that blizzard paralyzed Washington, just like before the blizzard. In fact, the only thing not frozen in Washington right now are Iran's assets. Well, we could spend a good part of the evening talking about political leadership in America across the spectrum, including the ongoing presidential campaign. But let me just start by expressing my nostalgia for President Reagan, who I believe was the greatest president I worked for of the 8, and one of our all-time great presidents. And I will share with you my favorite personal Reagan story. And it was right before he was to meet with Mikhail Gorbachev for the first time. And I was in the Oval Office briefing him, and there were a number of others, George Shultz and others sitting there. And he was seated in the wing back, and I was seated at the end of the couch, immediately adjacent to him. And I began my briefing, and a couple of minutes into my briefing, the hearing aid in his left ear began to screech. And I could tell from the expression on his face that it had to be painful. And he reached up and adjusted it a little bit. And I went on with my briefing, and a couple of minutes later, it screeched again, even louder, and he really winced in pain, and with some disgust, he reached up and plucked the hearing aid out of his ear, and he pounded it in his hand. And as he was putting it back in his ear, he leaned over and whispered to me, "It's my KGB handler trying to reach me." One thing to be said is that candidates like Donald Trump and Senator Sanders have tapped into a very real frustration on the part of many Americans for elected politicians at the national and at the national level, and the all too often incompetent, arrogant, dysfunctional, and just plain bossy government they lead. Presidential candidates are talking in one way or another about the problems and inadequacies of government and business. But the candidates are largely focused on primal scream therapy rather than actual solutions. This new book, A Passion for Leadership, Lessons on Change and Reform from 50 Years of Public Service, is about how you can actually fix these institutions, how you can change and reform government and other big institutions that govern our day-to-day lives, and make those institutions work better, be more cost-effective and more responsive to both citizens and customers. Because the truth is, if we don't fix our institutions and do so urgently, it can have a catastrophic consequence for our way of life, our financial security, our national security, our freedoms, and at times, our very lives. My book and my remarks tonight are about how the lack of courageous, tough-minded leadership underlies the many failures of institutions, both public and private, in recent years, and how good leaders can transform underperforming and broken organizations. Despite the political paralysis in Washington and elsewhere, bureaucracies inexorably intrude ever more pervasively into our daily lives. They influence our health, our safety, our economic well-being, our children, what we eat, what we drive in every business, farm, and educational institution in the land. Yet even as bureaucratic tentacles extend their reach into every nook and cranny of America, the litany of their incompetence, corruption, and arrogance grows exponentially. Many of these institutions are now indispensable, but their repeated and highly publicized failures have shaken the public's confidence that government in general, and sometimes business, can do anything right. Just a sampling of the lapses and failures in recent years, regardless of who was minding the store in the White House or in the Congress, is profoundly disturbing. 9/11 itself, a failure of intelligence and law enforcement of monumental consequence. The failure of virtually all our financial, regulatory, and administrative bodies to anticipate and prevent the abuses that led to the financial meltdown in 2008. The Federal Emergency Management Agency's handling of the aftermaths of Hurricanes Katrina and Sandy and other disasters. The multiple and continuing failures of the Veterans Affairs Department. Challenges to the integrity of the Internal Revenue Service. Lapses and scandals of the Secret Service. The initial handling of the Ebola crisis by the Centers for Disease Control. The botched rollout of the Obamacare website. The waste of billions of dollars on failed procurements in the Defense Department, contaminated water in Flint, Michigan, and so much more. And then there's the everyday travail of Americans in dealing with impenetrable, impersonal, infinitely complex, obdurate, and all too often arrogant bureaucracies, such as Social Security, Medicare, local, state, and federal taxing authorities, getting a driver's license, getting a building permit, or remodeling your house, dealing with the phone company, your credit card issuer, a billing error by a big chain store, healthcare insurance, university and public school administrations, and it's a rare soul who has not been frustrated and maddened by multiple business bureaucracies, not to mention disastrous business decisions that cost millions of jobs and create economic turmoil and heartache. Hardly a day passes in the life of any American without having to battle one or another bureaucracy. It doesn't need to be this way. I believe institutions, bureaucracies, large and small, can be changed, fixed, made more cost-effective and user-friendly, efficient and responsive, and shaped to meet new problems and challenges. I know because, with the help of some great colleagues, I did it at 3 very different institutions I led: the Central Intelligence Agency and the dozen or so other U.S. intelligence organizations, Texas A&M University, now the nation's 5th largest, and the Department of Defense, the largest and most complex organization on the planet. And my colleagues and I at all three places showed that a dysfunctional political environment is not in itself an overriding impediment to changing and reforming bureaucracies. After all, there wasn't exactly a lot of reform going on in the bureaucracy before political paralysis set in. You may ask how the lessons I learned in those institutions are applicable for leaders in local and state government, other parts of the federal government, education, business, nonprofits, for organizations of every kind. But consider this: in external appearance, people are infinitely diverse. Yet beneath the skin, our anatomy and the way the body works are pretty much the same. So it is with bureaucracies. Each shares a lot of DNA with its kin, even distant cousins. Despite the vast variety of bureaucracies in both the public and private sectors, their cultures, their organizational structures, and both internal and outside influences on their operations and behavior are remarkably similar. And thus the strategies and techniques for changing them, reforming them, are remarkably similar. In truth, every bureaucracy needs to reform, to modernize, to get rid of paralyzing procedural and operational barnacles that have accumulated over time, reduce waste, and become more efficient, effective, and user-friendly. Reform is not a luxury, but a necessity. With skilled leadership, things can be made to work so much better. And by showing that things can change, can get better, I hope in some small but significant way to convince Americans that the institutions that too often fail us can be reformed, and to show that leaders at all levels can make that change come to pass. And so I've written this book, a book about people and how to lead them where they often don't want to go. It's about how a leader can make an institution better, both for those who work there and for those they serve. It is about improving lives. In the limited time I have, I'll skip over many of the concrete suggestions and recommendations in the book about establishing goals and agenda for reform, developing strategies for implementation, and implementation itself. I want instead to focus on two central components of change and reform that I write about: the personal characteristics necessary for a leader who would successfully bring change, and the relationship between such a leader and those who work in his or her organization. People, not systems, implement an agenda for change. As the leader pursues a reform agenda, he or she cannot overlook the fact that the attitudes and commitment of their employees will determine success or failure. A critical component of a strategy for change is winning the support of those in the trenches who deliver the mission of the organization. Recognition of their role and demonstrating respect for them go a long way. Any fool can, and too often does, dictate change from the top. Fundamental to enduring success, though, is inclusiveness, getting as many people involved as possible, especially among the career professionals. Making the effort to prepare various constituencies for change is a step often omitted by new leaders. Real and symbolic actions and gestures of respect toward career employees early on can and does have significant impact in softening resistance to change and persuading people to be receptive to what a new leader is trying to do. In implementing change in any bureaucracy, the leader must delegate responsibility to subordinates and empower them to carry out the task. Lasting change depends on those below the leader embracing the change and taking ownership, making it their own. The more frequently the leader butts in, implicitly reminding his or her lieutenants that it's his or her change, the less they will believe it is theirs. The leader can't hold individuals accountable for driving change if he refuses to let go of the steering wheel. The leader must trust his subordinates, replace them if necessary, but he mustn't micromanage them. A leader must provide his or her people with the tools and opportunities for professional success and satisfaction. He must empower them and provide them with respect, motivation, job satisfaction, upward mobility, personal dignity, esteem, and finally the confidence that the leader genuinely cares about them collectively and each person individually. You can be the toughest, most demanding leader on the planet and still treat people with respect and dignity. And now a few words about the critical factor in leading organizational reform, the leader. How does a true leader of reform conduct himself or herself? First, the best leaders have their egos under control. They empower subordinates who are given the lion's share of credit and accolades when success comes, just like the sign on President Reagan's desk. A reform leader's primary goal should be to get the job done, not personal glorification or self-satisfaction. The environment created by an egotist is the antithesis of what is required to lead reform successfully. Second, a leader, whether in the public or private sector, must have integrity. Every leader in public service and business will at some point need to stand alone and apart, to speak truth to power, and to do the right thing. That can be a very lonely place, but is where leaders who can effectively reform institutions are found. If one seeks to lead men and women, you must persuade them to follow you, and that means they must trust you. A leader's actions must match his words. Integrity in action becomes moral authority, and it is moral authority that moves people to follow someone even at personal risk or sacrifice. Third, self-discipline is central to the leadership of institutions and to reforming them. Being an effective leader, especially a reform leader, requires a lot of self-control. Silence and restraint are essential if undervalued tools of leadership. Temper tantrums, desk pounding, yelling by a leader are an embarrassment and a waste of time and energy. The daughter of the U.S. Chief of Naval Operations in World War II, Admiral Ernest King, once described him as the most even-tempered man she'd ever known. He was always in a rage. One of the reasons I believe the leader of an institution, any reformer, must exercise great self-discipline has to do with subordinates. If the boss can't control himself, that sends a signal to those at lower levels that such behavior is acceptable, and that hardly creates an environment in which inclusive participatory reform can take place. It sounds old-fashioned, but the leader of an institution needs to be a role model. Fourth, courage is not a word that automatically pops into mind when thinking about bureaucracies. But any time a mid-level leader in government or business tells his boss and his colleagues that the old way of doing things is no longer adequate and that change is necessary, it is a courageous act. Even when the man or woman in charge takes a stand that most people, at least initially, oppose, it requires courage. Fifth, another key aspect of successfully reforming institutions, public or private, is taking the work seriously, but never yourself. Never underestimate the extraordinary power of humor. Ronald Reagan certainly did not. Dwight D. Eisenhower wrote his son in 1943, "The one quality that can be developed by studious reflection and practice is the leadership of men." The idea is to get people working together because they instinctively want to do it for you. Essentially, you must be devoted to duty, sincere, fair, and cheerful. Devotion to duty, sincerity, fairness, good cheer. These are not qualities taught in school. Formal education can make someone a good manager, but it cannot make a leader, because leadership is more about the heart than the head. How does any organization teach courage, integrity, a love of people, a sense of humor, the ability to dream of a better future? How can any training program inculcate personal character and honor? Core to leadership is the ability to relate to people, to empathize, understand, inspire, and motivate. If you fundamentally don't like or respect most people, or if you think you're superior to others, chances are you won't be much of a leader, at least in a democracy like ours. Just because you're high on the organizational ladder and can tell people what to do does not make you a leader, just a boss. I'll conclude with a few words specifically addressed to public service. Seems especially appropriate in this place. The columnist Walter Lippmann wrote long ago, "Those in high places are more than the administrators of government bureaus. They are more than the writers of laws. They are the custodians of a nation's ideals, of the beliefs it cherishes, of its permanent hopes, of the faith which makes a nation out of a mere aggregation of individuals." If you scratch deeply enough, you will find that most of those in public service, the custodians, no matter how outwardly tough or jaded, are in their heart of hearts romantics, idealists, and optimists. They actually believe it is possible to make the lives of their fellow citizens better and the world a safer place. But an important part of what makes America unique is that our nation's ideals and hopes and faith are manifested not only in individuals, but in our institutions. Accordingly, we can only bring our ideals alive, fulfill our hopes, and strengthen our faith as a country by improving the institutions that are the instruments through which we can achieve those goals. The question is whether new leaders, new agents of change, are up to the challenge. President Harry Truman once said, "Every great achievement is the story of a flaming heart." The task of reforming institutions is a difficult one. A leader's heart must be on fire with the belief in what he seeks to do. Changing institutions is a battle and must be undertaken with courage, strength, and conviction. The leader must believe in it before he or she can persuade others to believe in it. The leader must be prepared to put his or her job on the line if asking others to risk their careers and reputations to help. President John Adams wrote his son, "Public business, my son, must always be done by somebody. It will be done by somebody or another. If wise men decline it, others will not. If honest men refuse it, others will not." My fervent hope is that this book will encourage the wise and honest among us, especially young people, to consider serving our fellow Americans with confidence that public institutions can be reformed and shaped to serve and to succeed. Thank you.
Secretary Gates has been kind enough to stick around a little while to answer questions you might have. We only ask that if you have a question, raise your hand and wait until we get the microphone in your hand so we can identify who you are. We have one right here.
I had an opportunity to see a movie recently, and I would just like to ask you, what was the CIA doing in Benghazi? And I mean that sincerely. I'm not trying to put you on the spot.
Well, it's a good question, and since Benghazi happened about 5 months after I retired, the answer is I don't know. I have always thought that the central question about Benghazi, just as an observer, has been how many requests were there for additional security, and who made the decisions with respect to that security, and at what level in the State Department, and why? I'm not sure I've ever heard the answers to those questions.
Over here.
Is it on? Thank you for your service to the Boy Scouts of America, first off, thank you. With the service that you've had to our country in so many positions, what is the single biggest threat that you might see that we have as a country, other than, let's say, somebody in San Bernardino with a gun, something that would be of significance? What keeps you up at night in that regard?
The answer to that question is pretty straightforward. I think the greatest threat to our national security and to our future is to be found within the 2 square miles that encompass the Capitol building and the White House. If we can't figure out how to work together as Americans, if we can't begin to make progress on some of the problems that affect our country, if we can't deal with deficits and the federal debt and immigration and infrastructure and education and things like that, I don't think there's a single foreign threat that poses as big a danger to us as that kind of paralysis. Our politics in this country have always been polarized and nasty. And, you know, the truth of the matter is, unlike Burr and Alexander Hamilton, we haven't had a vice president shoot a secretary of the Treasury recently. But for my entire career and before, there always were enough people in both parties who wanted to move the country forward and deal with our problems that we were able to do so. And one of my favorite examples is actually from a time that was every bit as polarized and as ugly as today, and that was 1947. Harry Truman was president. He still has the record for the lowest public opinion approval rating of any president in modern times. The Republicans controlled both houses of Congress. It was incredibly acrimonious. The election of 1948 was coming up. And yet in 1947, with the help of a Republican senator from Michigan and a Republican representative from here in California, Harry Truman got U.S. membership in NATO. He got approval of the Marshall Plan. He got approval of aid to Greece and Turkey that laid the foundations for the policy of containment against the Soviet Union. And he created the Defense Department, the Air Force, the National Security Council, and so on. I will tell you that in the last 10 years, just to take something simple, in the last 10 years, the Department of Defense has begun the fiscal year with an enacted appropriation twice. And that was 9 and 10 years ago. So the paralysis of the government affects everything. And so if we can't figure out a way to deal with that and get more people who are more concerned about doing the right thing for America rather than getting reelected, I think we're in trouble.
Right over here.
Dr. Gates, Ronnie Seawright is my name, and my grandmother loved Ronald Reagan, so she asked my parents to name me Ronnie, and I salute you. My question comes from the heart because you spoke of the heart, and I would like to ask, what can we do as Americans, and closer to home, what can I do to make America a great country?
Well, I think one of the things that, there are a lot of things that you can do, and I like to remind young people that you don't have to join the government or go to work full-time for a nonprofit or for some government entity to render public service. There are many, many ways in which you can get involved in your community and help people in your community to live better lives, whether it's one or another volunteer organizations like the Scouts or 100 others that I could name. So I think there are things that you can do short of making it a career where you can really make a difference in your community. And I know a lot of business people and university faculty and others who are deeply engaged in their communities and making them better. I think one thing that is missing, frankly, on the electoral side is that there are so many people who get to November and they look at the ballot and they say, how the hell did we end up with these people? And the reason is the people who are asking that question didn't go to the polls in February. They didn't go to the caucuses in February. And so only the hardcore base of each party shows up in February. And guess where a lot of the candidates go? That's how you win the nomination. And since there are only about 50 or 60 House seats now not safe, that are actually contested, not safe for either Republicans or Democrats, nomination is tantamount to election in most of those. So the other thing that you can do is get involved in politics just by showing up. You don't have to be a political leader, but just by showing up and casting your vote for the people that you think will actually help move the country. I think that's important, and frankly, not very many of us do it.
Here in the back.
How do you do, Mr. Gates? In pretty much every generation, we get one really magnificent person for president, such as Eisenhower and Truman and Reagan. And today, the candidates are nowhere near that stature, if anybody here disagrees. I think the only person in this generation is you. And I would recommend very highly that you seriously consider running for office of president.
My wife knows who you are, and she knows where you live.
That was my question. Would you really,
That was his
would you consider running for
And
president?
I think that was my answer. Let me just say something, and I realize this reflects against at least one candidate. Presidency may be the most taxing job in the world. And you need somebody with a lot of energy and a lot of stamina to be able to do it. And I think that, my view, I watched President Reagan all 8 years from inside the Situation Room. And the way he governed and the quality of people he surrounded himself with helped him do that job effectively. But he still, when he left, was considerably younger than at least one of the candidates that's running. So I just think, and I'm 72, so I think that, but I do wish we could find somebody else.
Right over here, Mr. Secretary.
Mr. Gates, thank you for your service. Would you outline what you think a reasonable strategy might be for the U.S. dealing with the Middle East and ISIS in particular?
Yeah, I think one of my real concerns is that I believe we face a generation of conflict in the Middle East. I think there are 4 conflicts going on simultaneously. Shia Islam led by Iran versus Sunni Islam led by Saudi Arabia, authoritarians versus reformers, secularists versus Islamists, and then the broader, perhaps most dangerous question of whether artificially created countries comprised of historically adversarial ethnic, tribal, and religious groups, specifically Libya, Iraq, and Syria can hold together, or whether they will splinter as Yugoslavia did in the early 1990s. I am not an optimist, and I believe that in 20 or 25 years, and maybe sooner, the borders in the Middle East are not going to look like they look today as a result of all these conflicts. In a way, Syria is an epicenter of all 4 of those conflicts. So we have a region essentially from Algeria to Pakistan that in one way or another is in flames. And as best I can tell, the United States has no strategy for dealing with it. And particularly for stepping back and saying, if we're going to be faced with a quarter century of conflict here, what is a basic kind of strategy we can adopt toward the region with constituent parts that we can sustain with some consistency over time, regardless of whether a Democrat or a Republican is in the White House? Pretty much like the containment strategy of the Soviet Union. This is more complicated than that, but we ought to be able to say, we're going to do more with our military. We're going to have a larger military presence there, not to fight necessarily, but for deterrence purposes and to let people know we will protect our interests, providing more assistance and building greater regional relationships with our friends, deciding whether to let whether a problem like Syria has to burn itself out regardless of the cost, and how to deal with terrorist groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda. I think some of the proposals that have been put forward by a variety of people for dealing with ISIS are unrealistic. Some people have suggested putting 10 or 20,000 U.S. troops into Iraq to go after them. What they overlook is that the Iraqi government doesn't want 10 or 20,000 U.S. troops and has just been quarreling with us over adding some helicopters and another couple of hundred special operations forces. And the notion that an Iranian-influenced government in Baghdad is going to ask the U.S. to reintroduce major combat formations into Iraq, I think is completely unrealistic. Similarly, the notion, then the other alternative is, well, we need Arab boots on the ground. We need Arab armies in there to fight ISIS, Sunni armies. The idea of an Iranian-influenced government in Baghdad inviting Sunni armies into Iraq, dominated by a Shia government, is not going to happen. So I've been arguing for months a greater intensification of our support through special operations forces, forward air controllers and spotters, trainers down to the battalion level in the Iraqi security forces, as well as emplaced with the Sunni tribes, the Kurds, and others who are willing to fight ISIS, providing them with weapons directly, and in effect strangling ISIS and denying them the caliphate. One of the problems that I see with the strategy or with what's going on right now is that every Sunni city that has been liberated, it's been destroyed. So Kobani, Sinjar, Ramadi, and even the Baji oil refinery, Tikrit, all those cities are in ruins, totally. Now, a big part of it is ISIS bombed them. But also part of it was the bombing of our own campaign to get them out of there. But at $30 oil, Iraq doesn't have the money to rebuild those cities, even if they wanted to. And I don't think they do. So what happens to all those Sunnis? So this is a very tough problem. Frankly, one of my problems with some of the presidential candidates is they keep offering simple solutions to what are very difficult problems. And carpet bombing them or making the sand glow is not an answer.
Over here.
I first of all read your book, Duty, really enjoyed it, and have enjoyed tonight. And I agree with the gentleman, and let me talk to your wife, you need to run. But also for Ronnie, I have all kinds of wonderful volunteer ways he can get involved up in Santa Clarita, part of the Veterans Memorial Committee. I help put on Veterans Day. I work with the Gold Star parents, and most of you know what that means. And my husband is a Vietnam veteran, so I'm involved in the auxiliary for the Vietnam Veterans of America. So there are lots of ways, and I agree with you. If we can at least do our little part in our communities, it can spread. And thank you for all you've done.
Let me just add a pitch to that. One of the things that I spend a fair amount of time on is job opportunities for veterans. And I'm associated with several because I want veterans to have choices. And this is where a lot of you come in. A lot of you are hirers. And there is no better person that you can hire for a job than a veteran. These men and women are eminently trainable, they're loyal, they're disciplined, they're accustomed to working in teams, they're accustomed to working with a wide array of socioeconomic partners from a wide variety of socioeconomic backgrounds. They're great employees, so that's one place where everybody can help.
Right over here, Mrs. Secretary.
Thank you, sir, for your comments on leadership. And I know that one of the reasons why it's difficult to motivate people my age and younger to turn out and vote for our country is that it's very difficult for them to assess the qualities necessary in a true and real leader from a distance. Are there a few attributes that you could identify that we can be looking for in candidates that would identify them easily to people as real leaders, the kind we need who can affect change?
Well, first of all, there's a whole chapter in the book on the qualities of leaders, but it's not focused on presidents, so let me focus on presidents. I can't do better than a statement made in the early 1930s by Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. about Franklin D. Roosevelt. Of Roosevelt, Holmes said, he has a second-rate intellect and a first-rate temperament. Our greatest presidents, Washington, Lincoln, both Roosevelts, Truman, Eisenhower, Reagan, all were self-confident, comfortable in their own skin, and were smart enough to know they weren't the smartest man in the room, but smart enough to surround themselves with people that they thought were, and to listen to them, to encourage independent-minded, thoughtful people to advise them, and then to integrate that advice with their own experience and wisdom and instincts to make decisions. And that's what I think every one of those presidents did. So if I think the question that's never been asked of any of these candidates in either party is, what kind of people are you going to surround yourself with? We actually don't think you're very smart. Who are you going to get to advise you? Who are the kind of people? You don't have to name your cabinet now, but who are the kind of people that you think ought to be around a president? Now, one of my favorite stories is a very famous one, and it concerns General George Marshall. And as a two-star general, he was invited to a meeting in the Oval Office with FDR, I think in 1939. And FDR made some comment about producing 10,000 planes a month or a year or whatever, and what he was going to do with them and so on and so forth. And he went around the room, and the Secretary of Treasury and various other people were there, and they all said, well, that's a great idea, Mr. President. They came to Marshall, who was not Chief of Staff of the Army at the time. And Marshall said, oh, Mr. President, I don't think that's right at all. I think that would be a terrible mistake. And as they were leaving the meeting, the Secretary of the Treasury puts his arm around Marshall's shoulder and he said, "Well, it's been nice knowing you." And a year later, Roosevelt named Marshall Chief of Staff of the Army, and he became the architect of victory in World War II. And Marshall has always had a great reputation deriving from that and other similar experiences of speaking truth to power. But the guy who also deserves a hell of a lot of credit from that exchange was Franklin D. Roosevelt, who prized candor and was willing to have people around him who would tell him when they thought he was wrong. And that's a very hard thing to do. Most executives are more like Samuel Goldwyn, one of the founders of MGM, who once gathered his staff and said, "I want every one of you to tell me the truth, even if it costs you your job." So I would say, if I could pick one thing, it would be, who are you going to look to for advice? Or do you not think you need advice from anybody?
Back here.
Thank you so much. First, I'd like to mention that the reason that I'm here is that I read your book, Duty, and I noticed what I would call a true character formation. It's not just that you're a public servant. And I once referenced your book and your true character formation in a group, and they said, "What is true character formation?" I thought those were words that everybody understood. But thank you so much, and it's obvious that your parents were very developmental in your true character formation. My question pertains to Hezbollah and the operation of Hezbollah behind the scenes. For example, Khobar Towers. And from the reading that I've done, I've surmised that Hezbollah was involved in, and I know this was after you left, but the Benghazi situation had attracted some Hezbollah operatives who apparently appeared to be acting as al-Qaeda through Ansar al-Sharia. How much of Hezbollah is al-Qaeda and or others? In other words, are we to believe what we always see, or is Hezbollah operating behind the scenes in ways that we cannot imagine?
Well, first of all, let's be clear about Hezbollah. Hezbollah has killed more Americans than any other terrorist group in history except al-Qaeda on 9/11. You mentioned Khobar Towers, but in 1983 they also blew up the U.S. Embassy. They also blew up the Marine barracks in Beirut and killed almost 300 Marines. Hezbollah is funded by Iran. Hezbollah is fighting on the side of Assad and Iran inside Syria. These are bad guys. Now, they are not to be confused with al-Qaeda, partly because al-Qaeda is Sunni and Hezbollah is Shia. And that's why they have the close relationship with Iran. Iran has funded and armed Hezbollah for 35 or 40 years, I mean, ever since the Iranian Revolution, really. So I think your concern about Hezbollah is very well placed. And they are a serious menace in the Middle East and a serious contributor to instability.
Time for one last question over here.
Hi, I'd just like to thank you so much for coming out and talking to us. It's been really eye-opening. I'm a high school student at the Anacapa School in Santa Barbara, and I did a report on Guantanamo Bay, Cuba last year, and I was just wondering what your opinion is and what your stance on Guantanamo Bay is.
Well, I think that the position on Guantanamo should not be about Guantanamo, but what we do with the people in Guantanamo. And my view is that there are several dozen people, at least several dozen people in that prison who must never be allowed out of American custody. They will go back. They make no secret of the fact that if they're released, they will go back and try and kill Americans. Now, my view is, I don't have a, if we could figure, the reason that they are in Guantanamo is that the lawyers can't figure out how to bring them to the United States without them falling under the umbrella of the Constitution, in terms of all of the rights to a trial, a speedy trial, and so on and so forth, and all the protections that we have in our regular criminal system. It seems to me that the Congress ought to be able to fix that. And it may not be fixable under current law, but some smart people ought to be able to figure it out. I don't have a, if we could do that, then I think we should close Guantanamo and put these people in a supermax prison here in the United States. We've got a lot of people in Florence, Colorado that are just as dangerous as these terrorists. And there's no doubt in my mind we can keep them, then they're never going to escape. Needless to say, the senators from Colorado are less than interested in that possibility, as are the senators from Kansas, who do not want them in the federal prison in Leavenworth, as are the senators from South Carolina, who do not want them at the Charleston Naval Brig. So this is the problem. It's a not in my backyard problem. And that's why we're wrapped around the axle in terms of closing Guantanamo. President Bush, Condi Rice, and I all argued for closing Guantanamo while he was still in office in his last 2 years. The challenge is figuring out how to do it and keeping those people there in our custody and never letting them out to hurt Americans. If we can figure a way to square that circle, I think we should close Guantanamo in a heartbeat. I think that it still has a reputation around the world as for some of the abuses that took place in the early years. I will tell you right now, Guantanamo is an amazing prison. I mean, there's a library with Islamic literature and magazines. There are ellipticals, lots of exercise equipment, lots of televisions. It's a pretty nice place, actually, now. But it still has the stain, and therefore it ought to be closed, but only if we can find a way to hang on to those terrorists.
Mr. Secretary, just been absolutely marvelous. And on behalf of Mrs. Reagan, our Board of Trustees, and everyone here, we want to thank you so much for coming out tonight.
Thank you all.
Ladies and gentlemen, if you will allow us just a few moments to get our guest of honor out, and then those of us who are joining us.